The Louvre at night is not a museum. It is a labyrinth of shifting shadows, hollow whispers, and unseen eyes watching from the darkened halls. The Mona Lisa does not smile. She stares, unblinking, as if she knows something you don't. Statues that should be lifeless seem to exhale in the dim glow of emergency lights. Footsteps echo where no one walks. The air is thick with something ancient, something hungry, pressing against the silence like a held breath. Once the doors are locked, once the last tourist has left, the Louvre becomes something else. And if you work the night shift, you follow the rules, or you do not leave at all. I learned that the hard way. The job sounded easy at first. Overnight security, just watching the monitors, walking the galleries, making sure no one broke in. But when I arrived for my first shift, the supervisor, a gaunt man named Marcel with hollow eyes and a voice like dead leaves, handed me a folded piece of paper. "Read these carefully," he muttered, "and no matter what, do not break them." I unfolded the paper and my stomach tightened. The rules weren't normal. Rule number 1, do not look at the Mona Lisa for more than 10 seconds. If her expression changes, look away immediately and count to 10 before looking back. Rule number 2, if you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Walk calmly to the nearest exit. If the footsteps follow, pray. Rule number 3, the Egyptian wing must be locked before midnight. If you see someone inside after that, do not let them out. They were never supposed to leave. Rule number 4, if you hear a woman whispering in the Richelieu wing, do not listen. Cover your ears and walk away. If you understand what she's saying, it's already too late. Rule number 5, the statues move when you're not looking. Do not let them surround you. Rule number 6, if you find yourself in a gallery that is not on the map, leave immediately. Do not look at the paintings, do not listen to the voices, and do not, under any circumstances, touch the walls. I laughed nervously. This is a joke, right? Marcel didn't laugh. Do your job, follow the rules, that's all. That night, I sat in the security office, watching the flickering screens. The Louvre is massive, long corridors, endless rooms filled with artifacts older than memory itself. Most of the cameras showed nothing but stillness. But at exactly 11:58 p.m., a motion alert blinked on the monitor for the Egyptian wing. I leaned closer. The timestamp read 11:59. A tall, dark figure stood between the towering statues of Anubis and Sekhmet. My stomach clenched. I checked the locks. The Egyptian wing was sealed. No one had entered. No one should be inside. The figure didn't move. It was too still, too rigid, like something caught between a blink. I grabbed my flashlight, my breath tight in my chest, and stepped into the marble halls. The silence in the Louvre at night is suffocating. Every footstep echoes like a gunshot. I reached the entrance to the Egyptian wing and peered through the glass doors. The lights inside flickered. The figure was gone. My hands trembled as I checked my watch. Midnight. I swallowed hard and turned to go. A shadow passed in the reflection of the glass. I spun around. The statues had moved. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, was no longer facing forward. Her head had turned slightly, just enough to watch me. The Anubis statue had shifted too, angled toward the exit as if waiting. I backed away slowly, the rules burning in my mind. If you see someone inside after midnight, do not let them out. Something scraped against stone, a dry, hollow sound like fingers brushing ancient rock. My pulse pounded. I turned the key, locking the door. And then I saw it. The glass reflected more than just the statues. A face stared back at me, hollow eyes, stretched mouth, something too long and too thin to be human. It stood inches from me, just beyond the glass. The lights flickered. The reflection did not. A whisper drifted through the halls, dry as dust. "Let me out." I ran. My footsteps slammed against the floor as I sprinted back to the security office. The cameras flickered with static, the feeds distorting. And then I saw the Mona Lisa's room. The light above her flickered, casting shadows that didn't match the furniture. The velvet ropes that kept visitors away were lying on the floor. And her face, God, her face had changed. The smile was gone. She was grinning. I shut off the monitors. The rest of the night, I sat in the chair, gripping the rules in my shaking hands, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps returned around 3 a.m., slow, measured, coming from behind my chair. I did not turn around. By sunrise, the museum returned to normal. The statues stood in their rightful places. The Egyptian wing was still locked, and the Mona Lisa smiled her usual, knowing smile. Marcel walked in and saw my face. He nodded. "You saw them." I nodded, unable to speak. You followed the rules. Yes. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Good. As I left the museum that morning, I glanced at the glass doors one last time. My reflection stared back at me. The museum's glass doors shimmered under the early morning light, but in the reflection, something shifted. A blur, a shadow, a presence that should not have been there. My breath hitched and I took a slow step back, heart pounding in my chest. The world beyond the Louvre was waking, traffic humming, voices murmuring, but behind me, in the vast, silent corridors of the museum, something watched. The feeling of unseen eyes burrowed into my spine, a weight pressing against my skin. I clenched my fists, forcing my feet to move. As I stepped outside, the chill of morning air did little to shake the sensation that I had carried something with me. Or worse, that something had let me go. For now. By the time I got home, exhaustion pulled at my limbs, but sleep did not come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Mona Lisa's grin, the shifting statues, the reflection that did not belong to me. And behind it all, a whisper lingered, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Let me out. I don't remember when I finally drifted off, but when my phone buzzed that evening, dread curled in my gut. My next shift, I stared at the screen, stomach twisting. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to never set foot in that place again. But I knew the rules. I had seen what happened when they were followed, and I had no intention of finding out what happened when they were broken. The Louvre after dark was the same as before, vast, empty, silent. But something in the air felt different, heavier. The moment the last tourist left and the main doors were locked, it was as if the museum exhaled. The lights dimmed, the temperature dipped, and the very walls seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. Marcel was already in the security office, hunched over the monitors. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers tapped restlessly against the desk. "You saw something last night," he said without looking at me. I hesitated. "Yes." He nodded as if he expected it. "They know you now." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. "What does that mean?" He finally turned to face me, his eyes dark and sunken. "It means they'll test you." Before I could ask what that meant, the monitor on the far left flickered, the Egyptian wing. My pulse quickened. The motion sensor had been triggered. Marcel stiffened, his face turning grim. "Check the locks." My hands felt numb as I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the Egyptian wing. The halls were colder than before, the marble floors seemingly leaching the warmth from my body. When I reached the heavy doors, I tested the lock. Secure. No sign of forced entry. But the air was different, stale, thick with something that did not belong to this world. Through the glass, I scanned the room. Nothing. The statues stood motionless, the sarcophagi untouched. But something felt off, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my skull. I stepped closer, trying to shake the unease slithering up my spine. And then I saw it. A single footprint in the dust. Not a shoe print, a bare foot, too long, too thin. The breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, pulse hammering. The rules. If you see someone inside after midnight, do not let them out. I did not know if something had gotten in, or if something had woken up. The whisper came again, so soft I almost mistook it for the wind. "Let me out." I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. The corridor behind me was empty. The statues behind the glass had not moved, but the footprint, it was gone. Panic clutched at my throat. I turned the key in the lock, securing the doors. The whisper came again, closer this time, just behind my ear. I did not turn around. I did not run. I walked, forcing each step to be steady, measured. The air pressed against me, thick and suffocating, until I finally reached the security office. Marcel saw my face and exhaled sharply. "They're testing you." A shudder racked my body. "What does that mean?" But he did not answer. He simply turned to the monitors, jaw tight. The night stretched on, but the unease did not fade. At 2:43 a.m., another motion alert blinked. The Richelieu wing. The blood drained from my face. The rule. If you hear a woman whispering in the Richelieu wing, do not listen. Cover your ears and walk away. I stared at the screen, dread coiling in my gut. The cameras showed nothing but empty corridors, the grand statues looming in eerie stillness. But the whisper slithered through the speakers, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, low, murmuring. I scrambled for the volume knob, twisting it down to 0, but the whisper still crawled through the air like something alive. It was not coming from the monitors. It was coming from inside the security office. The room was small, windowless. There was nowhere to hide. And yet, the whisper curled against my ears, soft as silk, cold as the grave. I slammed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. Do not listen. Do not listen. The whisper grew louder. The words were still muffled, but I could hear the shape of them, the edges of something ancient and hungry. My hands pressed tighter against my skull, nails digging into my skin. The lights flickered, my breath hitched, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened my eyes. The security office was unchanged. The monitors flickered, showing only stillness. Marcel stood in the corner, watching me carefully. "You almost listened," he said quietly. A chill crawled down my spine. "What happens if I do?" He did not answer. Outside, the Louvre remained silent. It was watching. It was waiting. And tonight had only been the beginning. And I knew, with a certainty that gnawed at the edge of my sanity, that it was growing bolder. The Louvre's walls pulsed with an unnatural stillness, the kind that belonged to graveyards and forgotten ruins. The weight of unseen eyes bore down on me as I sat in the security office, my breath slow and measured, my pulse thudding in my ears. The air smelled of dust and old stone, but beneath it, something else lingered, a faint, rotten scent, like something ancient stirring beneath the floor. Marcel had left me alone. He hadn't said where he was going, hadn't told me what to do if the whispers returned. He had simply stepped out, closing the door behind him without a word, as if he already knew that tonight I would be tested again. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. I kept my eyes on the monitors, but the screens flickered with static, distorting the empty halls into something unrecognizable. The Richelieu wing remained quiet. The Egyptian wing was still. But the Mona Lisa's room, my stomach clenched. The velvet ropes that had been carefully placed around her display were now on the floor. Again, my fingers tightened on the desk. I had seen this before. I had left them undisturbed, unwilling to acknowledge what it meant. But now something else was wrong. The camera angle had not changed, and yet the Mona Lisa was closer. I knew it was impossible. The painting was fixed to the wall, secured behind reinforced glass. But my eyes did not lie. She was no longer perfectly centered in the frame. The delicate lines of her hands, the curve of her face, they were off, as if she had shifted, as if she was leaning in, watching me. A sound crawled through the speakers, not a whisper, not the slow drag of something unseen, a creak. My breath hitched, the sound of something heavy moving, something wooden, something old. The floorboards of the museum did not creak. The Louvre was built of stone, marble, and iron. The noise did not belong here, and yet it came again, closer. I grabbed my flashlight, throat dry. My fingers shook as I turned the volume down on the monitors, muting the sound, but I could still hear it. Not through the speakers, through the walls. Something was moving inside the museum. I forced myself to stand. The rules. Follow the rules. My footsteps barely made a sound as I stepped into the corridor. The air was colder than before, the temperature dropping with each slow breath I took. The Mona Lisa's gallery was at the end of the hall, the dim glow of emergency lights casting long shadows along the floor. The door was open. I had not left it that way. The rules screamed in my mind, but I stepped forward anyway. The creaking had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed against my ears, too thick, too heavy, as if something had swallowed all the sound from the air. I hesitated at the threshold. The Mona Lisa sat in her glass case, exactly where she had always been. The ropes were still on the floor. The lighting was dimmer than it should have been, casting strange, elongated shadows along the walls. I took a single step inside. The door shut behind me. The lights flickered. And then, a breath. Not mine. Soft, shallow, right behind me. I did not move. The air against the back of my neck was warm, too human, too wrong. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, to do anything but stand there. But I knew better. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the key in my pocket. My fingers closed around the cold metal, my pulse hammering as I took a single step forward toward the Mona Lisa's glass case. Her smile had changed. My stomach lurched. I could not explain how I knew, but it was different. Wrong. Wider. The corners of her lips stretched too far, the expression no longer serene, but expectant. I squeezed my eyes shut. Do not look for more than 10 seconds. If her expression changes, look away. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. The breath against my neck grew colder. 4, 5. A whisper slithered through the room, dry and brittle, like dead leaves scraping against stone. 6. My body locked in place. The whisper did not form words. It was something else. A presence curling around me, waiting, hungry. 7. A creak sounded behind me. A step. I bit my tongue, forcing myself not to run. 9. The whisper stopped. 10. I opened my eyes. The Mona Lisa's face was the same delicate brushstrokes, the same careful expression. But I knew what I had seen. I turned slowly. The gallery was empty. The door was still closed. But something was wrong. The paintings along the walls were no longer still. I do not mean that they had moved from their positions. I mean that they were moving. Figures twisted within the canvases, shadows curling and shifting, mouths opening in silent screams. The subjects who had once posed so elegantly were now writhing, hands pressed against the glass of their frames as if trying to get out. My breath hitched. The paintings watched me. Eyes followed as I stepped back, their movements frantic, desperate. The rules. The rules. I forced my legs to move, my steps slow and measured as I made my way to the door. My fingers fumbled with the key, my hands slick with sweat. The whispering began again, but this time it was not behind me. It was coming from inside the paintings. Hundreds of voices, some weeping, some screaming, some laughing. I turned the key, the lock clicked, the whispers stopped. I did not look back. I stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me, sealing whatever horror lurked inside. The Louvre was silent once more. But as I walked back to the security office, I heard something far worse than whispers. I heard laughter, soft, muffled, coming from the paintings along the corridor. And as I passed them, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The people inside the frames were no longer screaming. They were smiling. Their smiles stretched too wide. Their eyes gleamed with something unnatural, something knowing, as if they had been waiting for me to notice. The paintings lined the corridor, their frames dark and ornate, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the movement ceased. The faces froze, their eerie expressions locked in place. The laughter faded, swallowed by the Louvre's oppressive silence. But the air had changed. It was charged now, electric with something unseen, something waiting just beneath the surface of reality. My pulse pounded as I quickened my pace toward the security office, my ears straining for any sign of movement behind me. The hall stretched on longer than it should have, the exit door seeming impossibly far away. The shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, shifting with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. My fingers clenched into fists. Do not run. Do not let them know you're afraid. The rules. I had to follow the rules. I reached the office, forcing myself not to slam the door behind me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh white glow over the room. The monitors flickered with static before the security feeds came back into focus. I scanned the screens, my breath coming in short gasps. The museum was still. Nothing moved. No shadows, no shifting paintings, no laughter. But I knew better. I sat down, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. Marcel was still gone. I didn't know where he had gone, or if he was even still here. Had he heard what I'd heard? Seen what I'd seen? The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and then a knock. Soft, rhythmic. Coming from the door behind me, my spine went rigid. The security office was locked. No one should be here. Another knock. This time, slower. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the door in my peripheral vision. The handle didn't move. The knock didn't come again. But something was there, waiting, watching. The rules. Do not open the door if someone knocks after midnight. I swallowed hard. Midnight had passed over 30 minutes ago. I stayed perfectly still. Silence. A minute passed. 2. My heart pounded against my ribs. The monitors buzzed softly, the screens flickering, but then my blood turned to ice. One of the cameras, the one facing the Mona Lisa's gallery, was not empty anymore. A figure stood in the center of the room. Tall, motionless. Their back turned to the camera. My breath caught in my throat. The image was grainy, distorted, but I could make out the shape of a person. Not a security guard, not a visitor. Their clothing was dark, old-fashioned, something that did not belong to this era. The air in the office grew heavier, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. I stared at the screen, willing the figure to move, to do anything to prove that it was just an error, a glitch in the feed. But they did not move. They just stood there. And then, without warning, the camera feed cut to static. A shiver crawled down my spine. The knocking returned, louder this time. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. My hands were damp with sweat. The security room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in around me. Do not open the door. Do not acknowledge it. The knocking stopped. A long, sickening silence stretched through the room. And then, a voice, whispering through the door. My stomach lurched. It was low, raspy, as if someone's throat had been rubbed raw. I could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, insistent, hungry. My hands clenched the arms of the chair. The rules did not say anything about a voice. The whispers grew louder, closer, crawling beneath the door like a living thing, and then something scratched against the wood. My breath hitched. It wasn't a casual noise. It was deliberate, slow, testing. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my fingers against my ears. It is not real. It is not real. A sudden, sharp click rang through the room. I jolted. The lock had turned. My stomach dropped. The door creaked open just an inch. I couldn't breathe. The fluorescent lights flickered, the room dipping into darkness for half a second before stabilizing. My gaze locked onto the small sliver of the open doorway. Nothing was there, but the hallway beyond it was wrong. The museum lights should have been dim, casting long, familiar shadows. But instead, there was nothing but pitch blackness, a void, a darkness that swallowed everything beyond the threshold. I could not see the walls, the floor, the paintings. Just an endless, empty black. And then, a footstep. I slammed the door shut, throwing my full weight against it. My hands fumbled for the key, turning the lock so hard I thought it might break. Silence. I staggered back, my breath ragged. The whispers were gone. The scratching had stopped. The door remained closed. But the monitors were different now. The camera feeds were no longer empty. They were filled with figures, standing, motionless, watching. Some were in the halls, some were in the galleries. Some were pressed up against the security cameras, their faces twisted into unnatural grins, their eyes nothing but black voids. I stumbled backward, my chair tipping over behind me. The camera feed for the security office blinked on. I looked at the screen. My stomach lurched. There was someone standing behind me, tall, shadowed, smiling. The lights flickered, and then the door unlocked again. A sharp click echoed through the security office, slicing through the suffocating silence. My body went rigid, every nerve screaming at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. My limbs were frozen, locked in place by a terror so deep it rooted me to the spot. My gaze snapped back to the monitors, to the feed showing the security office. The figure behind me was gone. But I could still feel it. The cold prickle of unseen eyes on the back of my neck. The air pressing in, thick and heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. Do not look. Do not acknowledge them. The rule pounded in my head, desperate, urgent. The lock clicked again. This time, the door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, until a sliver of darkness split the room. The air beyond was wrong. Too dark, too empty, too still. The Louvre's dimly lit hallways should have been visible, but instead there was only an abyss, stretching endlessly beyond the threshold. A shape shifted in the darkness, not stepping forward, unfurling. Something was crawling out of the black void beyond the door. I choked on my breath, my chest tightening as an overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me. The shape was too tall, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. It stopped just at the edge of the doorway, its body shrouded in shadow. And then, it smiled. A wide, grotesque grin stretched across its face, teeth gleaming in the dim light. My stomach twisted. The mouth was too wide, the lips too thin, as if its face was struggling to mimic something human but failing miserably. A whisper slithered through the crack in the door. "You left the door unlocked." My blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It was gentle, almost playful, and it was coming from inside the room. I slammed the door shut and threw myself against it, my fingers fumbling for the key. The moment the lock clicked into place, a deafening knock thundered against the wood, rattling the frame so hard I thought it might splinter. Bang! The door shuddered under the force. Bang, bang, bang. Whatever was outside wanted in. The knocking grew erratic, frantic, the force behind it shaking the entire office. My breath came in sharp gasps, my vision tunneling as panic wrapped around my throat like a vice. Do not open the door. Do not let them in. The rule repeated in my mind, looping over and over. And then, silence. The pounding stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The air was thick with expectation, waiting for me to react. The monitor feeds flickered. The cameras cut to static, all except one. The Mona Lisa's gallery. My stomach dropped. The figure was back, the one that had been standing in the gallery before. Only this time, it was facing the camera. And it wasn't alone. More figures stood beside it now, dozens of them. Silent, still, their bodies shrouded in darkness, but their faces were clear. They were the paintings. Their features twisted into grotesque smiles, their empty eyes locked onto the camera, onto me. I scrambled away from the monitors, my back hitting the wall. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A sound crackled through the speakers. Laughter, low and distant at first, then growing louder, filling the room with a chorus of unnatural giggles. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "He sees us now," a voice whispered through the speakers, distorted and warping. The lights flickered, the room plunging into momentary darkness. When they blinked back on, the monitors were off. The door was open. The hallway beyond was no longer an abyss. It was normal. The Louvre was still there, its empty corridors stretching out in eerie silence. But something was different. The air felt wrong. The paintings that lined the hallway, portraits of old nobility, kings, queens, and long-forgotten faces, were all turned toward the security office. Every single one of them. And they were all smiling. Not the delicate, mysterious kind of smile that made the Mona Lisa famous. These were unnatural, grotesque grins stretched too wide across painted faces, their teeth uneven, lips curling as if they were amused by something only they could see. My chest tightened. These paintings had hung in the Louvre for centuries, their expressions frozen in time. But now they were alive. A suffocating stillness filled the hallway. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to move. The air was thick, heavy, like stepping through invisible cobwebs. The feeling of being watched dug into my spine with every step. Each brushstroke face seemed to follow me, their painted eyes gleaming as if wet. They were waiting. The security office was no longer safe. The rules, I had followed the rules, but something had changed. The Louvre was shifting around me, twisting its ancient bones into something wrong. I had to keep moving. I needed to make it to the grand staircase, to get out of this wing before. A whisper slid through the silence. It came from the portraits. Not one voice, but many, layered over each other in a quiet, rustling murmur. Words I couldn't understand. Hushed, conspiratorial, growing louder the longer I stood there. A chill raced up my spine. My breath hitched as I realized they weren't just whispering. They were talking to me. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A figure, standing in the center of the hall, just beyond the reach of the dim emergency lights. Too still, too tall, too thin. My stomach lurched. Not human. I didn't turn my head, didn't acknowledge it. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move carefully, slow, controlled, like a rabbit inching away from a coiled snake. The moment my foot touched the marble of the grand staircase, the whispers stopped. Silence crashed down like a wave. The air crackled, and then the lights above me shattered. Glass rained down, tiny shards catching the dim glow from below. The darkness thickened, swallowing the upper levels, pressing against my back like unseen hands urging me forward. My breathing came sharp and shallow as I descended the steps. Do not run. Do not let them see your fear. Then I heard it. A sound so wrong, so unnatural, it turned my stomach. A canvas stretching, like someone pulling skin too tight over a frame. My fingers clenched the cold railing. Do not look. The rule hammered in my skull. But I didn't need to look to know that something was stepping out of the paintings. Soft, papery footsteps, the scratch of dry brushstrokes moving against the stone floor. They were coming down the stairs with me, a slow, deliberate movement. No rush, no need, because they knew I had nowhere to go. The Louvre was endless at night. I could run forever and never reach the exit. The rules were the only thing that had kept me alive this long. But now, I had broken something. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped. My own breath was too loud, too harsh in the silence. I forced myself to move forward, one step at a time, towards the central gallery. And then, a breath, right in my ear. Stay with us. A voice not made for this world. Something cold dragged down my spine, as if unseen fingers had traced the length of my back. A dry, papery touch, like old parchment against bare skin. I ran. The rules shattered in my mind, instincts taking over as I bolted down the grand staircase, through the vast, yawning galleries, past statues that seemed to turn their heads as I passed. My breath tore through my throat, burning, as my feet slammed against the marble. The Louvre twisted around me. The halls stretched longer, doors disappeared. The way back to the security office, gone. The emergency exits, gone. There was only one path left, the Dinan wing. I didn't want to go there, but the Louvre wanted me to. The air changed as I passed under the archway. The lights here were brighter, but the shadows longer. The halls were quieter, but I could feel something moving just out of sight. And then I saw it. The Mona Lisa. She sat in her glass case, unchanged, untouched, her smile exactly as it had always been. But as I stepped closer, my body locking up against my will, I realized her eyes were wrong. They weren't looking at me. They were looking past me. My body turned before my mind could stop it. And I finally saw them. The figures from the monitors, standing in the gallery, silent, watching, their painted faces stretched into smiles. The last thing I saw before the lights cut out, their hands were reaching for me, stretching out from the darkness, elongated fingers like wet paint dripping off a canvas. The moment the lights died, the room became something else. An abyss where the paintings bled into the real world, where the figures lurking in the Louvre's shadows could finally step forward. A breath? Too close. A whisper, inside my ear, not outside of it. Stay. I bolted, but the air itself seemed to resist me, thick as oil, pulling at my limbs. The walls groaned, their ancient bones shifting as if the museum was alive, twisting itself into a labyrinth. The Mona Lisa's case shattered behind me, but I didn't dare look back. The thing wearing her smile was free now, and I knew it was coming for me. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs as my feet slammed against the marble. Every corridor looked the same, but none of them led where they should have. The Louvre was changing, sealing me inside. I turned left, a dead end. Right, another hall that hadn't been there before. Then, footsteps, not mine. They followed me, but they didn't run. They never needed to. I stumbled into a vast open gallery, the Sully Wing, where the museum kept its oldest relics. Moonlight cut through the high windows, casting long shadows across the ancient sculptures. Their faces, worn and cracked from centuries of existence, turned toward me. Not subtly, not my imagination. They moved. One by one, statues of emperors and forgotten deities shifted on their pedestals, their stone features twisting into expressions of hunger. Some were missing arms, others had empty sockets where their eyes should have been, but I could feel them seeing me. A scraping sound filled the chamber. Not metal, not stone, canvas. The paintings were following me. I spun toward the entrance, gone. The way I'd come had melted into darkness, trapped. The statues stepped down from their pedestals. Their movements were slow but deliberate. Dust fell from their joints as they breathed for the first time in centuries. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. Behind me, the massive frame of a Renaissance painting peeled away from the wall, its gilded edges curling like a mouth opening wide. I heard something inside it, a heartbeat, not mine. A hand, long, ink-drenched fingers, reached out from the portrait's depths, grasping at the air. The figure inside, unfinished and wrong, dragged itself forward. Its face flickered between brushstrokes and something far too real, its empty eye sockets filling with black oil as it pulled itself into the world. I ran. I had no choice. The statues lunged, the paintings rippled, and the Louvre came alive around me. A corridor opened where there hadn't been one before, its stone walls pulsing like the museum was breathing. It should have led to the medieval foundation, the oldest part of the Louvre, built when it was still a fortress. But as I tore through it, my lungs burning, I realized the air had changed. It was thick with rot, the scent of old, dead things buried beneath centuries of art and history. Then, footsteps ahead of me. Someone was there. Not one of the creatures. A real person. A shadow moved just beyond the archway at the corridor's end. My chest tightened. Who else could possibly be here? The Louvre's night shift was small, and no one ever broke the rules, not if they wanted to survive. I hesitated. Then, the figure spoke. My name. I shouldn't have heard it. It came from a place that had no mouth, and as the figure stepped into the dim emergency light, my entire body locked up in terror, because I knew that face. It was mine. It shouldn't have been possible, but there I was, standing just a few feet away. Same uniform, same expression. But something was wrong. The skin was too smooth, like a painting given too many layers of varnish. The eyes were just a little too large, the mouth just a little too wide. It smiled. "You shouldn't have run," it said in my voice. I staggered back, my stomach turning to ice. The statues had moved. The paintings had stepped down from their frames. But this was worse. It was me, or something trying very, very hard to become me. It stepped closer, its head tilting in an unnatural way, like a marionette whose strings had been jerked too hard. "I can take your place," it whispered. "You just have to let me in." A cold hand brushed against mine. Paint, not flesh. And suddenly, I understood. The museum didn't just keep things inside, it created them, it copied them, and if I stayed here long enough, I would become one of them. A replica, an exhibit, a part of the Louvre forever. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I had to move, had to get away before it. A second voice, behind me, a whisper, crawling up my spine. "You already belong to us." I turned, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. A living, breathing void where sound twisted and the air grew thick with something that watched. My pulse hammered in my throat, the last whisper still echoing inside my skull. "You already belong to us." I couldn't see, couldn't move, but I felt them all around me. The statues, the paintings, the things that had crawled out from the canvas and broken free from their frames. The Louvre was no longer a museum. It was a tomb, and I was just another artifact waiting to be claimed. A sound, wet, close, wrong. Breathing, not mine. I forced my feet to move, inching backward. My shoulder hit something cold, stone, rough and ancient. I reached out blindly, fingers skimming the surface. The texture was cracked, broken with time. Then, skin, not mine. I jerked away. The whispering started again, all around me, shifting, circling. The darkness wasn't empty, it was full. Then, a single light, not from above, from the floor. A thin, glowing slit in the marble, like a door left slightly ajar. An opening, a way out. Or a trap. Something moved in the blackness. A ripple, a disturbance in the stale air. Whatever it was coming closer. I had seconds to decide. I dropped to the ground, scrambling toward the light. My fingers brushed the edge of the opening, warm and pulsing, like flesh. A breath exhaled from below, not air, something else. I hesitated, a mistake, because in that moment, the darkness reached for me. Hands, too many hands, grasped my arms, my legs, my throat. Fingers with no bones, just paint and shadow, curling around my skin like vines. They pulled. I tried to scream, but something slithered into my mouth, thick and oily, drowning the sound before it could escape. I fought, clawed, kicked. My hands slammed against the floor, right on the light. A click. The Louvre shifted. The ground beneath me vanished, and I fell. Not onto marble, into something deeper. I hit the ground hard, pain rattling through my bones. The air down here was thick, damp, ancient. A place untouched by time. The walls pulsed with faint golden light. Not electrical, but something older, something alive. I wasn't in the museum anymore. Not the one I knew. I was in its heart. A tunnel stretched ahead, winding and endless. And in the dim glow, I saw them. Not paintings, not statues, people, or what was left of them. They stood frozen along the walls, their skin cracked like old canvas, half-formed, half-erased. Some had no eyes. Others had too many. Their mouths hung open, as if they had tried to scream, but had been silenced before the sound could escape. My breath shuddered. They weren't just anyone. They were the ones before me. The ones who had broken the rules, the ones who had been claimed. And at the very end of the tunnel, past all the ruined figures, something waited. Tall, wrong, a thing made of oil and time, shifting between brushstrokes and flesh. A curator of the lost. It had no face. Only a void where one should have been, as if the paint had never dried. But when it turned toward me, I knew it was smiling. I was never meant to leave. The thing without a face tilted its head, the motion unnatural, like a painting struggling to come to life. The tunnel around me breathed, its walls flexing, shifting, alive in a way stone never should be. The frozen figures lining the passage seemed to lean closer, their mouths stretched in eternal, silent screams. I was being watched from all sides. A single step echoed in the distance. Then another. Not mine. The curator was moving toward me. I tried to run, but the floor was wrong. Thick, soft, sticky, as if I had stepped into wet paint. My shoes sank slightly, the ground trying to pull me deeper. I wasn't on stone anymore. I was on canvas, a raw, unfinished painting, stretching endlessly beneath me, waiting to be completed. With me, The curator raised a hand, and the figures along the walls trembled. Cracks splintered through their skin, and something inside them, something dark, liquid, unfinished, began to leak. The paint spilled from their mouths, their eyes, their hands, running down their bodies in thick, oily streams. The smell of old varnish and rotting wood choked the air. They were melting. No, they were being erased. And I was next. A voice, not a whisper, not human, spoke, but not aloud. It sank straight into my bones, curling inside my head like wet ink soaking into parchment. You do not belong here. Yet. The curator took another step, and the walls pulsed brighter, not warm, not light, but something ancient, something older than the museum itself. I could feel it in my teeth, in my skull, in the very fabric of my being. I was running out of time. I tried to rip my feet free, the paint holding me in place like living tar. My hands scraped against the tunnel walls, fingers sinking into the cracked surface of one of the frozen figures. It twitched beneath my touch, its remaining eye rolling toward me, desperate, pleading. And then it spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but with a single thought, burned into my mind like fire on parchment. The light. Find the light. I didn't hesitate. My hands clawed against the wall, searching, slipping through crumbling flesh and empty sockets. Then, a flicker, a small golden glow, buried beneath layers of peeling paint and twisted, ruined features. I dug my fingers in, ignoring the squelch as the surface beneath my nails gave way. The curator was closer now, the air thickening, the tunnel closing in. I could feel the paint pulling at my skin, sinking into me like it was already making me a part of the exhibit. I ripped the light free. The tunnel screamed, a sound like canvas tearing, like 1,000 voices wailing at once. The light in my hands exploded, flooding the space with something too bright, too sharp, like the first stroke of a brush on an untouched canvas. The curator reeled back, its form flickering, as if the light was unmaking it, dissolving its edges into dripping, unfinished strokes. The frozen figures twisted, their melted bodies recoiling from the glow. The paint beneath me vanished, and suddenly I was falling again. Not through darkness, through frames. Hundreds of them, thousands, a maze of paintings swallowing me whole. The world twisted, spun, colors bleeding into one another. I could see glimpses of places, of people, of things trapped inside the art, all reaching, all screaming, and then I hit the ground. Cold, hard, marble. I gasped, my body convulsing, lungs burning like I'd been held underwater for hours. The world was no longer twisted, no longer bleeding. I was back in the museum, but the Louvre was not the same, and neither was I. The air felt wrong, charged with something old, watching, waiting. The paintings were not still. Colors shifted, brushstrokes breathed, figures twitched in the corners of my vision. The floor beneath me hummed, like the heartbeat of something vast, something alive. I forced myself to stand, my limbs aching, stiff, as if I had been trapped inside one of those paintings for centuries. My hands were coated in something slick, and when I looked down, paint. Thick, dark, seeping from my skin. A shudder raked through me, and I wiped it off on my uniform, but the stain remained. The museum around me seemed to shift, the hallways stretching, elongating, the shadows deeper than before. The glass cases no longer reflected me, and then the lights flickered. Once, twice, then they died. Darkness swallowed everything. A silence so absolute, so crushing, that I could hear the faintest movements, the sound of fabric rustling, footsteps brushing against marble. Not mine, not human. I wasn't alone. A glow pulsed to life behind me, faint, golden, the same light I had torn from the wall of the tunnel. It flickered at my feet, casting long, stretching shadows, but its warmth was gone. Now it felt like a single ember in a room filled with something cold and starving. A breath, not mine, brushed the back of my neck. I spun around. Nothing. The silence stretched, too deep, too knowing. My own breath felt intrusive, like the museum itself was listening, waiting for me to make a sound. Then a voice. Not a whisper. Not human, but one I recognized. You are not finished. A figure loomed just beyond the reach of my dim glow, standing in the darkness where the hallway should have ended. The curator. But it was no longer wearing a mask. It had no face at all. Just a blank, hollow void, as if someone had tried to paint a head but never finished. The edges of its form bled into the air, its shape smudging, shifting, like a half-dried brush dragged across canvas. It took a step toward me, and the museum groaned. Not the walls, not the floor, but the paintings, the artifacts, the history itself. The portraits shivered in their frames, the statues exhaled dust, the tapestries unraveled. The world was unmaking itself around me. I was becoming part of it. My skin felt tight, wrong, as if something beneath it was trying to seep through. The paint on my hands was spreading, crawling up my wrists, sinking into me like ink soaking into paper. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering, my body burning. I had to get out, now. But the hallways had changed. The exit was gone. Only paintings remained. Hundreds of them, lining the walls, stretching higher, wider, their contents shifting, writhing. Some were unfinished, just shadows of figures waiting for a final brushstroke. Others were portraits, but the faces inside them were familiar. I took another step and my foot sank. Not into marble, into canvas. The floor beneath me had turned to oil, to brushstrokes, and my legs were sinking into it. The figures in the paintings began to move faster, their hands reaching, their mouths opening in silent screams. I thrashed, fighting to pull myself free, but the paint was thick, pulling, consuming. The curator stepped closer, its featureless void where a face should be tilted slightly, as if observing a work nearly complete. The voice returned, deep and ancient, inside my mind. The Louvre does not take visitors, only exhibits. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the nearest frame, desperate, my fingers digging into the ornate gold edge. The paint beneath me dragged me deeper, climbing past my waist, my chest. My reflection rippled across the glossy surface, but it wasn't me, not entirely. Something was wrong with my eyes. They were hollow, empty, a canvas waiting to be filled. No, I wasn't part of this. I wasn't finished. I fought harder, my body thrashing, the paintings around me screaming without sound. The curator reached out, its hand touching my forehead. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw everything. The Louvre was not a museum. It was a body, a living thing. And we, all of us, were just strokes on its endless, eternal masterpiece. We did not work here. We belonged to it. I opened my mouth to scream, but the paint filled it first. The Louvre exhaled, and then there was silence.